And we think we are able to be born today and to live in no myth, without history. That is a disease. That's absolutely abnormal, because man is not born every day. He's once born in a specific historical setting with specific historical qualities, and therefore he is only complete when he has a relation to these things. It's just as if you were born without eyes and ears, when you are growing up with no connection with the past. From the standpoint of natural science, you need no connection with the past. You can wipe it out. And that is a mutilation of the human being.
So let's get down to business on the history of the idea of the unconscious. It's going to be quite informative. For instance, we do have to consider where this idea of the unconscious comes from. We think of the idea of the unconscious as a psychological term. So the first step is actually, where does psychology come from, right? And the difference between psychology and psychiatry. Because in understanding the history, the first thing we have to understand is that psychiatry is very old, back to the first writings, and we have documents in ancient Greece going back to Hippocrates, and in Galen, in Roman times, doctors, medicines, talking about diseases and illnesses, and you'll find descriptions there of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia and depression, all the way back, carried through a medical tradition to the present day. Psychiatry. Psychology, on the other hand, actually began in philosophy. For the longest time, the aspects of human nature and thinking about human nature were in philosophy, combined with theology, as in Christian theology in the West for a long time, but in the philosophical tradition. So we're looking for that moment when psychology moves from philosophy to its own thing. And actually, the idea of the unconscious begins to be that pivot, or the basis for the pivot. In other words, the very first time there's the use of the term the unconscious is in the year 1800 with a German philosopher called Friedrich Schelling. Schelling wrote a book called The System of Transcendental Idealism in 1800, in which he, for the first time, used the term Unbewusstsein. We have to say it in German because the unconscious comes initially in German. So what does that mean? We have Bewusstsein, meaning consciousness, and Unbewusstsein, meaning the unconscious. Now, Schelling is obviously writing this book on transcendental idealism. And what does that mean? Another German philosophy, which takes us immediately back to Immanuel Kant. Kant lived from 1724 to 1804. And Schelling is coming out of the Kantian tradition. We may need to talk later about Kant, because that becomes a stream of psychology, especially in Carl Jung, who is steeped in Immanuel Kant. For now, the main thing we have to know about transcendental idealism, which begins with Kant, is a book that Kant wrote called The Critique of Pure Reason. He wrote it in 1781, and then it was revised in 1787. Critique of Pure Reason. The most important thing for psychology that comes out of Kant is his distinction between two things, right? Things as they are, which in German means Ding an sich, the thing in itself, versus the world of appearances, or phenomenon. So this is also the beginning of phenomenology. The way in which things present themselves is always through a filter. That's the world of appearances. The filter always gives a dim impression of what is behind the filter, what is behind the world of appearances, and that is things in themselves. Ding an sich. Psychology has never escaped this particular problem. And that is the foundation of the word, the unconscious. Now, another way to think about unconscious, which we're going to do the deep dive here, and just stay with me while we do the concepts and the etymology of various words, because they're descriptive, right? We have to ask ourselves, did no one have the idea of the unconscious before the year 1800 in German philosophy? Did no one even think that there was something behind the human awareness that is unseen, that is hidden? And the answer is, of course, it existed before it acquired the name das Unbewusstsein, the unconscious. In other words, before there was the philosophical concept of the unconscious, obviously, there was sort of the human experience of the unconscious. And now we're getting back to sort of a primary psychological experience. That's the way I like to think about it. People were aware that there was a distinction between being conscious and unconscious long before 1800. Another way to come at this is with a word game. I like word games. Maybe you like word games. And it's with these pairs of opposites that we can think about the ancient distinction between the conscious and the unconscious. So here are four pairs of words that I want you to think about, and then we'll work on the etymologies. Sleep versus wake. That kind of unconscious experience. Sleep versus wake. Forget versus to remember. Ignorance versus knowledge. And surprisingly, the root words for dead versus alive, which is really deadness versus aliveness. A very visceral, ancient perception of that quality of aliveness, which is force or movement or animation, and then that quality of deadness in which there is no force, no movement, no aliveness. We'll get to that in a minute. So let's start with the first word pair, right? Sleep versus wake. So we know the word in Greek already as it comes into psychology. The Greek word for sleep is hypnos. There's several words in Greek that mean to awake, but the word that applies most in this situation is exhypnizo. Hypnos to sleep, exhypnizo to awake. We get the same kind of contrast in Latin, where the word you know, of course, for sleep is somnum, as in insomnia. And the Latin word, or again, one Latin word for waking is evigilatonian. Evigilatonian. And of course, from that Latin root, we get our word vigil, vigilance, and really the word vigor is in evigilatonium, to wake. Two states, sleeping and waking. And the comparison is we have to go back then behind the Latin and the Greek to the Proto-Indo-European language, and we'll be referring to that a bit because all of these words, Greek, Latin, German, making its way into English, have a common root. In other words, Proto-Indo-European, Indo means India, and in this case it means Sanskrit. So there's a root word in Sanskrit called veg, W-E-G, which means force or strength of something, veg, W-E-G. The way that language works, weg, that root comes into German as wachen, and of course translates to English as to wake. That implies two states, right? Conscious and unconscious, wake and sleep. Let's try another word pair. To forget and to remember. It's interesting, if we go to the Latin, it's a word that you will know. Oblivicatur, to forget. Oblivion, right? Our word, the root word oblivion means to forget, and the Latin word for to remember is very close to our English word memanio, or another form that we know it as memento, to remember. In Greek, it gets us a lot closer to what we're talking about. There's several words for forgetting in Greek, in which the most famous is lethe, because we know that from mythology as the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. And from Lethe we get English words like lethargic and lethal, both in the sense of to forget. That's what lethargic means. Lethal, it's this sense of to render someone unconscious. Lethargic, lethal. That's lethe, but the other word is a word that you will know without thinking about it, because another Greek word for to forget is amnesia. Amnesia, which is thought of more as the A, as in not remembering. Amnesia. And then to remember is a more obscure word that analysts know. Anamnesis. Amnesia, anamnesis. Anamnesis means, in the psychological context, the remembering, essentially, that's the case history, either is told by the patient or the analyst carefully going point by point through the patient's history. Anamnesis. This root word for memory, back in the Sanskrit, is mamnao. That's where our word is derived from, and mamnao is a form of another Sanskrit word which sort of brings this full circle, which is manas. Manas is the word that we get our word man, as in human, comes from the word manas in the Sanskrit. What does manas means? Manas means mind. So to bring to mind, or that man, humans, are a creature who have a mind. That's the sort of original sense of it, as in Homo sapiens, and we'll get to Homo sapiens in a minute as we go through the Latin. So this Sanskrit is coming from the Vedas and the Upanishads. We're talking now about 1800 BC, and an ancient culture. Already in the Vedas and Upanishads, there's an idea of two manas, two minds. So here's another word that you will know. the Sanskrit word for waking, back to waking, is bodhi, from which is derived, of course, the Buddha, meaning the awakened one, the one who is awakened. Bodhi means awake. So the two kinds of mind back in the Vedas and the Upanishads are the bodhi manas, the awakened mind, and the kama manas. Kama means emotional, of the body. The kama manas and the bodhi manas. Two minds already in 1800 BC. So now we're not talking about the discovery of the unconscious and the first use of the word in 1800. Now we're going back 3,600 years into the Vedas with the concept of two minds. Okay, let's try the next pair. Ignorance and knowledge. The most interesting thing about those two words is that they both derive from the Greek word gnosis, Gnosis, meaning knowledge, gnosis. So our word know and gnosis, the GNO becomes the RKNO in English. And then think about that. The opposite of knowledge, the opposite of gnosis, then in Greek is agnosis, agnostic, agnosis, a-gnosis, right? The lack of knowledge. It works its way into Latin too, because you still see the gnosis in the Latin word cognito, which is really more the co-nito, Gnito. There's the gnosis again. You see the same thing in the Indo-European root, because the word in Sanskrit is prajna. Prajna means knowledge. In Indo-European, that JN of prajna becomes the GN of gnosis in Greek. So we can also think about the words for knowledge in Latin. I told you about cognito, from which we get, of course, cognition. Another word is sapiens, which is derived from the Greek sophia, a term you may have heard. Sophia means wisdom, and in Latin it becomes sapiens, as in Homo sapiens. And that goes back, of course, to Homo sapiens from Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish guy who in 1758 worked out all the phylum and categories of the entire zoological system. And a third word in Latin for knowledge is scientia, which sounds a lot like our word science, and it is in fact where we get the word science. The word scientia is derived from the Greek sideria, meaning to cut, or also the Greek word schizein, another form, which you've heard before when you think of schiz, which means to split. So scientia is sort of a form of knowledge made by cutting, made by splitting. Sometime, in this journey, we'll get to Jung talking about that is the work of ego consciousness to differentiate. This is not like this. That's a form of knowledge. That's a form of consciousness. And just briefly in Latin, the other word is another word I think you know. Intelliere, intelligence. But in Latin, intellegere. The legere is the verb in Latin for to link together, to put things together, as in ligature, like a rope, right? One other line I want you to think about, back to the Indo-European, is in Sanskrit you have knowledge as the term vidya, and ignorance as avidya, avidya, knowledge and not knowledge. That word vid you should recognize because, of course, that comes into English as video, which goes back then to this root of it actually to see and to not see. That's what knowledge is. To see, vidya, not to see, avidya. And that term, the vid, comes into German as vid. And vid, of course, in German, we get that. Our English words, wise, or weird, or wit, are all derived from this basic sense of vid, so that, to complete the circle, in German, wissen is the word for wisdom. Wissen is wisdom, and then through the weird way that the German verbs work, it becomes bewusst, which means to become conscious, to be conscious, Bewusstsein, consciousness, and Unbewusstsein, the unconscious. And finally, I think I've saved the best for last, the most important one, and that is the word pair dead and alive. I think what I really mean is the sense of deadness and the sense of aliveness. That is buried in the etymology of this way of thinking about consciousness and the unconscious. So, for instance, in Greek, you, of course, know that thanatos is the word for death and the god of death, and the word for life. There are three Greek words for life: zoe, bios, and psyche, as in zoology, biology, and psychology. I want to come back to psyche in a minute as the Greek word, because in the Latin, of course, you know that death is mortem and life is vita, right? Mortem and vita, which is pretty direct from in Sanskrit, death is mrityu, M-R-T-Y-U, and alive is javitam. And there's the vitas and there's the mortem, coming sort of straight into Latin. That sense of aliveness and deadness, now we go back to psyche, because that's another way of thinking about it. What is there's another word in the Indo-European for alive. It's not only javitam, it's the word atman. And that had the history and idea of atman is sort of all over the place. In Hindu mythology, atman is a being, a person. In fact, it's sort of the higher self. It's you. You are atman, or atman is in you. Now, where do we get the word atmosphere? From atman. An atmosphere in the sense of air or breath. That's what atman. And so it's this, again, visceral, primordial feeling of life and death. If you've had it in your life, I don't want to be too morbid about it, but to observe life and death, the really visceral experience is the breath. There's a deep sense that when a person is breathing, there is aliveness. When a person is not breathing, there is deadness. And that evokes a sort of what we come to call then a dualistic view, that the life that is in the person leaves when the breath leaves and the body remains. That's an essential dualism that is just part of human experience. And if you've ever had that experience, it's very real and visceral. The idea of breath is life, so that when the breath leaves a person, where did it go? So we have Atman. Now, going back up the chain, Atman appears in Latin in the word for soul, which is anima. If you take the N in anima and make it a T, atima, you see where Atman is still there. And again, the idea of breath is an idea of a soul that leaves. And now we come back to the Greek, and the word psyche means life. That psyche means breath. Psyche also means a butterfly. And that's how it's used in Plato. The butterfly of psyche is the fluttering of the breath. And that's where we get the sense of consciousness and unconsciousness. And now we're in a different phase where it gets more difficult to tell, well, what is conscious and what is unconscious? The body is the unconscious. The breath is the consciousness, but the breath can leave. The breath has a life of its own, and now that's a different kind of consciousness, implying a different kind of unconsciousness than the, shall we say, materialist worldview. This is relevant right this minute, right? Because in neuroscience, the whole goal is to discover, or a goal is to discover the source of consciousness before we could even talk about the unconscious. What is the source of consciousness? Well, if you're a materialist, by definition, consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain. What else could it be as a materialist? Consciousness is located in the brain. And we're back to no one can locate where consciousness is in the brain. And there are theories about information systems and other things about the neurons firing as, again, as a sort of emergent phenomenon, right? It's like we know that one neuron is not conscious. It's just a cell. But somehow when millions of neurons function together, there's a leap to a higher level of complexity. You know, this is chaos theory. An emergent property reveals itself, and that's what consciousness is. If you go back to the old way of thinking, then there's a sense of consciousness is separate from the brain. And that means the unconscious has the potential of being more than just the repository of repressed personal memory. So when I say that this is relevant right this minute, I really mean the so-called mind-body problem, mind-body dualism, sometimes referred to as Cartesian dualism, and which becomes the conflict with science, because science, as a materialist philosophy of science, believes there is only matter, and that is materialism. So I wanted to take you back through why we did the etymologies to understand, in the long run, this word psyche, which is a deeper way of talking about the unconscious. So if you remember in our words, we had the word group wake, remember, knowledge, and alive. And then on the other side, we had sleep, forget, ignorance, death. When you line those two up beside each other, it seems very much that wake, remember, knowledge, alive looks a lot like mind, and sleep, forget, ignorance, death looks a lot like the body. So here we come to the mind-body dualism. And another thing I wanted to share with you is that in the etymology, what you see, the further back in time you go, back to the Greeks, you're getting an idea of something alive being not in the body, which is sort of a Greek view of looking at the unconscious. So what is alive is not the body. What is alive and survives the body is the butterfly of psyche, the word soul. The further back in time you go, there's that view. The further closer in time you keep coming, there's more of an association with the mind being what is awake and the body being what is asleep. Now, that poses a real problem for a materialistic psychology in the sense that prior to the year 1800 and the beginning of so-called scientific psychology, when psychology separates from philosophy, psychology literally is the study of the soul. But in a materialist framework, that cannot be the object of the study of science. So let's talk about materialism for a little. What is materialism? Hopefully you know it is the basis of our modern technological culture. Materialism is the philosophical opinion that all that exists is matter. Matter has the properties that we know as the laws of physics. Matter is a closed system. Even in Einstein, we get something called the box universe. And the idea is we live within the closed system of the box universe. And there's nothing outside the system that intervenes in a closed system. Therefore, everything that happens is reducible, and there's a little bit the reductionistic part, to matter. Why does that matter for the unconscious and the study of psychology? The answer is there is no psyche. Psyche is an epiphenomenon of matter. And in this case, organic matter, the organic matter of the brain. So even today, when we talk about psychology, from my point of view, and really from this historical point of view, psychology today is ego psychology. It's the psychology of the ego, not the psychology of the unconscious, because all there is to study is the ego. And going back even into the late 1940s and finally coming into the 50s and the 60s, the pushback on the Freudian control of maybe academic institutions, training facilities, behaviorism comes along as a materialistic science of psychology, saying that all these things that we talk about, repression, displacement, the Freudian Oedipus complex, all of those things are ideas, and we can't measure ideas, and we can't make predictions from ideas, and we can't make observations about ideas. What we can look at, and the only thing that we know about psychology, is behavior, because we can measure behavior. We can experiment with various tests on behavior. And so behaviorism comes in slowly, but building into the 1970s is replacing the last vestige of the study of the psychology of the unconscious to become a purely materialistic science. So let's think about that for a minute. Well, let's start with this. From a materialistic point of view, anything about the psyche, a butterfly, a soul, is by definition, I think we want to use the word myth in the pejorative sense. We have a lot to talk about the concept of myth, but in the pejorative sense that it is factually inaccurate, it is not true. There is no soul, there is no God, and all of the ancient ideas and the images that go with ancient religions, much less modern religions, they're just the result of magical thinking or clumsy thinking. Like a child, the way that a child thinks that the lights in your house work, as if by magic. All of those are modes of thinking that have long since been debunked and overthrown, and nothing about them is useful. That is the mindset of modern scientific psychology, because they don't tell us anything about the functioning of the brain. So, one primary argument in the mind-body problem from the materialist is that if you say that there is a mind which exists not of matter, but of something in the ether, a thought is outside of the system, then please show how this thing that exists in a place that is not the place where everything else is able to influence our closed box. Because the materialist point of view is that everything that happens within the system, is a result of matter, the causality, functions without disruption. I would point out, actually, that there are specific cases of ways in which thought influences matter demonstrably, and it's not an illusion. For instance, a famous experiment that has to do with hypnosis. Hypnosis is, I hypnotize you and I give you the suggestion that I'm going to touch your arm with a burning iron rod pulled straight from the fire. I give you that suggestion. Now, that exists in a non-materialist space, the mind, because it is only a thought, the thought of being burned by a burning hot rod. Now, then, in the experiment, I touch your arm with a pencil. A materialist argument is that the cells don't know about the thought because cells don't have thoughts, and that a pencil is a pencil is a pencil. If it looks like sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, right? Nothing would happen but the result of the experiment. Of course, I've given you the suggestion. The skin blisters where I touch you with a pencil because of the suggestion, the thought, that it's a burning hot iron rod. That's not supposed to happen. That is then now this immaterial thought in the mind having an effect on matter, skin cells. Now, I need to add this part about this experiment about the blistering with hypnosis is really only attested in one paper from May of 1947, a Dr. Ullman, in the journal, American Journal of Psychiatry, which in that case is a PTSD victim, a World War II veteran, and you would have to say their there is a connection between PTSD and dissociation and a higher rate of suggestibility, meaning a stronger depth of hypnosis. And so while there were other papers and interest in these dermatological effects of hypnosis up in through the 1960s, it's not well validated. We can say that. But I use the story to be dramatic and to make a point. Another example that's a little more, you would say, is also the placebo effect. I mean, it's related. A belief in someone's mind that they're being given pain medication to relieve pain should have absolutely no effect on matter. And yet we know the placebo effect somewhat everywhere, that insofar as you believe you've been given medication to alleviate certain physical conditions, there is an ameliorative effect from the placebo. And again, that is a thought having a direct influence on matter. I can think of a couple other examples. There's the interesting phenomenon of the phantom limb. It's a little bit related, perhaps it's tangential, but the phantom limb, right? Again, in a way, there shouldn't be such a thing as a phantom limb, because again, that is a thought. It is immaterial, the phantom limb, but it's clear that people experience a phantom limb and have pain, and sometimes excruciating pain in the phantom limb. Materialists would say, well, that's because the brain is all screwed up. But in the so-called mirror therapy, you set it up so that the mirror looks like the phantom limb, and then when you massage and you give treatment to the phantom limb, the pain in the phantom limb goes away or is ameliorated to a great extent. That's kind of incredible, right? Another example you could use is the basic lie detector, right? The whole point about the lie detector is that theoretically, lots of research now, when you're telling a lie, the galvanometer registers a change in your heart rate, blood pressure, skin conductivity. It measures that change, and that's what all of those needles are about. The connection with the mind-body problem has to do with the fact that the thought that you lied exists only in the mind. It is immaterial, this thought that you lied. And how does a materialist explain how that thought changes respiration, blood pressure, skin conductivity? How can a thought change those functions in the body, which is matter? So with that in mind, I think what I'm trying to bring up is that when we look at the unconscious, we're going to have to make a decision as to whether we go with the materialist point of view or with a more dualistic point of view, that there is a mind which is not just an epiphenomenon of brain cells, which in the old days they used to call a soul or psyche. And I would say there's a particular problem with that. And the problem is, of course, mythology. The word soul, the concept of soul, the thought of soul, is by definition a religious concept within a religious context. And then how can we study the soul outside of any religious context? How can we study it in a purely psychological context? Is that even possible? And the answer is psychology gave up on that more than 100 years ago. What if there were a way to study these ancient images, both in the etymologies, the way it's talked about, and of course, represented by artifacts and art from all over the world in every tradition? Is there a way to study those concepts outside of a religious framework? Something that would be scientific, but it wouldn't be exactly a materialist way of looking at it, but it might be a heuristic way or phenomenology, which is to say, there's the scientific method that has its value, and then there are other methods like phenomenology and heuristics. What are those? We could spend a long time talking about that, but essentially phenomenology focuses on the phenomenon itself. It brackets the question of, well, it brackets any question it needs to get a hold of the inner experience, the inner subjective experience of a phenomenon. And we could say the phenomenon of soul, outside of any religious context and historical, that would be outside of a Christian context and the Christian idea of soul, outside of a Buddhist context and the Buddhist idea of soul, outside of the Muslim concept and the Muslim view of soul and the Jewish view of soul and the Old Norse view of soul and the soul as it is represented in Mithraism from the 1st century. Any of those contexts, is there a comparative way of just looking at the phenomenon? It brings you right back to Immanuel Kant, because in Kant we are getting a method that separates the thing in itself, Ding an sich, from the world of appearances. So it allows us to look at the world of appearances without, that would be bracketing in the phenomenological sense, the question of the ontological being that lies behind the world of appearances. And the answer is, what would that look like? And it looks like this. All of these images and the history of religion that lies behind it, the mythology, create a field of reference, a system of images that grow like fauna, straight out of the ground of the unconscious. And by knowing enough about the vast array of these images and symbols, we can begin to start to identify different types, different histories, different origins, different functioning. We can look at those symbols in an organic way, saying specifically that we do not know to what the symbols point, but we know they function in this way. In other words, this is the method of Carl Jung, which is to bring together all of the history of world mythology And also he observed in the dreams of his patient, and he talked about listening and interpreting 60,000 dreams in a period of 6 years, in a time after he broke with Freud, all those dreams. And also, of course, Jung got started in the Berkholzli Psychiatric Clinic in Zurich, where he observed the psychotic fantasies of mentally ill patients. And he began to notice the images and symbols in all three of these arenas: psychotic fantasies, the dreams of everyday people, and the history of world religion shared many of these images in common. So that's why Jung's definition of a symbol is the best possible depiction or formulation of a relatively unknown fact. That's the Kantian piece, right? We don't know ultimately that to which these symbols point, but we know that they point to something. So these images, symbols from dreams, psychotic fantasies, and the history of world religions, that is the data. They are data. We're going to have to talk about this a great deal more, because I think in the next episode we're going to have to get to the structure of the unconscious and the real differences in philosophical approach between Jung and Freud. But clearly there is a layer of the unconscious that is shared by all human beings. And one way to think about it is the evolutionary functioning of human beings, and that is inside of you, inside of me, inside of every little baby that is born, inside every old person at the end of their life. That strata of the unconscious, that is the instinctual functioning of a human being, is there. And these data points about the symbols and the images that can be collected, analyzed, categorized, now opens before us if we can get to this place of defining a symbol as the best expression of a relatively unknown fact. Now, there's the unconscious, right? So, to go back a little bit, psyche is soul, psyche is life force, psyche is butterfly, and the etymologies we looked at start to show this perception of something that is conscious and alive, but not in the body, something that continues. So we have to ask, is it even possible to scientifically examine the image of soul, the concept of soul, the symbol of soul? Now, let me explain how this works a little bit. This is a good example. For instance, you say, well, of course there's a soul, and you can study the soul. Why would anybody doubt that? And the first thing I have to say is, please tell me which mythological tradition you're coming out of. And I'm not doing that to be persnickety. I'm doing that out of an awareness of the history of ideas, the history of symbols. And you say, oh, I just believe in a soul, so how that's self-evident? And I say, I don't believe in a soul or disbelieve in a soul because my purpose is not about belief.
Do you believe?
Well, I can't say. You see, the word belief is a difficult thing for me. I don't believe. I must have a reason for a certain hypothesis.
either I know a thing, and when I know it, I don't need to believe it. If I don't allow myself, for instance, to believe a thing just for the sake of believing it. I can't believe it. But when there are sufficient reasons for a certain hypothesis, I shall accept these reasons, naturally, and should say, we have to reckon with the possibility of so-and-so, you know.
What I can say is that I am very aware and interested that this image of symbol of the soul appears all throughout history and all over the world in a variety of cultural and religious contexts. This is a fact. It's a historical fact, and it's also a psychological fact that people have this idea and are motivated by such an idea of soul. Whether it's, as we said before, whether it's in Africa or the Aborigines in Australia or the South American jungles or Western Christianity, Western Judaism, Islam, China, Japan, the Old Norse, the old Roman religions, back to the Upanishads in India, I'm aware that there is a vast historical tradition of this image. Atman, for instance, is a way of looking at soul, is an image. It's done in a Hindu way, in a Hindu context. And there are other ways and other contexts. So I am trying to understand the history of that symbol to see what we can learn that all of these different aspects have in common, and they point to something. The Kantian part, and then Jung's part about the symbol, is that ultimately, I don't pretend to know what this image of soul points to, ultimately and ontologically. I only know the history of the image and the power, the emotional power, the psychological motivation that the symbol represents when it appears in dreams or fantasies or in a religious cultural context. It's referring to something that is not my ego. What are these images referring to? As a human experience, there's the phenomenology. What are they referring to as a human experience? To me, that's the part that makes this dynamic unconscious, which includes, again, we have to get to another episode, in the structure of the unconscious. Certainly it includes what Jung came to call the personal unconscious, or the Freudian unconscious, which is all of the things that happen to us in our lifetime that are unique and individual to each person. But we also have to account for an unconscious that is not unique to each person, but is a part of the inheritance of the human species. This underlying layer that speaks to our behavior, our activities, our sense of meaning, and our creative expression through history and through the world. Now that is a dynamic and very interesting unconscious. As we move forward, that's what I want to talk about.